Welcome to Roundtable Talk, a podcast about longevity, senior services marketing, and the quality of life as one ages. Roundtable Talk is brought to you by Pavone Group and Varsity, a senior services agency focused on helping clients win the mature market. If you like the fresh perspectives we deliver in each episode, please give Roundtable Talk a 5-star review on the podcast service of your choice.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Varsity's Roundtable Talk. Today's guest is Diane Harris. Diane is an award-winning journalist, a well-traveled speaker, and an author with an expertise in personal finance and financial wellness. She's a former editor-in-chief of Money Magazine and a former deputy editor of Newsweek. And finally, she's a regular contributor to the New York Times. Diane, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm delighted to be here, Derek. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, our interview today is going to tackle two topics that you've written and spoken about recently. Solo aging and financial security during retirement. And then there's a third topic at the end, but we'll get to that later. We're going to start with solo aging. You wrote a terrific piece for the New York Times just in September of this year, in 2024, called Going Solo, How to Plan for Retirement When You're on Your Own. Now, in that article, you talked with Dr. Sarah Zeff-Geber, who coined the phrase solo aging and who I've interviewed recently on this podcast, as well as Joy Laverde, who we've also worked with as a guest on our weekly roundtable discussions. And both are great resources. Now, in your solo aging research, did any advice or strategies from Dr. Geber, Joy, or any other experts surprise you or stand out as particularly valuable?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a fascinating topic. I was really surprised to learn, how large a population solo agers are. And I'm glad that we're getting the chance to talk about this. What was most not surprising, but valuable in terms of the advice for me was that, solo agers face the same issues that everybody else faces as we age. You have to think about who is going to take care of you if something happens, who are your designees for healthcare and things like that. But without a person who you can rely on to turn to, it's the different circumstances that mean different solutions. And so what experts stress to me is that solo agers have to approach planning with an extra layer of intentionality and urgency. And that phrase really stuck with me. That's what I think is the most valuable takeaway. It's not that the issues are different. It's that different circumstances may dictate different solutions, and that you have to approach the whole thing with an extra layer of urgency and intentionality. Like most of us just assume our spouses or our kids will step in. That's not always right, but we assume it. Solo agers can't assume.
That's a great point. And the other thing that I found to be fascinating was when I heard the term solo ager, or when I think of that, I think of truly an individual, someone who is solo, whereas Dr. Geber, in the conversations we had with her, she was really defining it as someone without children or without that natural support network. So they may have a spouse, but they don't have have children who, in theory might provide that support, but we know that doesn't always happen either.
Right. I mean, I think that part of the value of this story for people who aren't solo agers is understanding that. Like, this advice is relevant to everyone because some of the assumptions we make about who will take care of us don't always turn out to be the case.
Great point. Now, you discussed the importance, as you were just sharing, of having that trusted support network. Solo agers often don't have the support. What are some ways to build that network that you have uncovered or thought about?
Yeah. So one of the things is to start simply by looking at your existing network. Look at the community that you belong to from, hobby groups that you might be involved in, places of worship, a community center, and look for ways and people whose relationships you might enhance or expand. Like start with your existing network and kind of work outwards.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing to start with. Another piece of advice that didn't make it into the New York Times story that I thought was great is to think about, like, often who do we hang out with? We hang out with friends and they tend to be our same age. So they're peers. Instead of hanging out with people by age, by our peers, look for ways to follow your interests. If you're a movie lover, an amateur photographer, you join a book club, whatever it is that you're interested in doing, but do it by the activity where you may meet people of different ages and different backgrounds. So you have a more diverse group, a more diverse community. And then look to your neighbors, to the people you regularly interact with. The most important thing, though, probably is where you live, is thinking intentionally again about where you live, because that can create a community. If people often say they want to age in place, but aging in place is tough.
Sure.
It can be lonely. It can be expensive if you're on your own and having, as you get older and it's a little harder to do things, you have to hire people to do them for you. So you might really think about making a change in where you live to maybe it's an adult community, for people 55 and older, where you have a built-in community and lots of services often are available to you, a continuing care community. Joy Laverde, who you mentioned, big advocate of NORCs, naturally occurring retirement communities, where you might be in an apartment building that has people of all different ages and backgrounds and services that are available to seniors and community events. And you naturally build a network of people who look out for one another. So those are some of the ways to strengthen your community and your network.
That's great. And you mentioned, earlier in your thoughts about enhancing your network, and I think that was a really interesting term, and it almost made me think, enhancing the relationships. I think that was maybe how you had said it, and relationships at the core is a two-way street, right? And I love the idea of going into some of your interest groups, because then you are connecting on a much deeper level, perhaps.
Yes.
It's not tethered by simply proximity, but it's tethered by something that really has an equal exchange of intellect.
Right. And it's also, I love the possibilities for intergenerational community.
Absolutely.
It's so helpful to both sides of that equation. Not just from the practical, okay, I'm looking for people who can help me out if something happens to me, but just for socialization and what you can learn from one another. Like I'm not a solo ager. I'm just your garden variety married with adult children ager.
Sure.
But I'm lucky enough to have a community and a network that is truly intergenerational. And I think it's just a tremendous benefit socially, professionally, and just in terms of keeping you vibrant and vital in our world.
That's great. That's great. Now, as we're talking about this, many solo agers struggle with choosing someone to make medical or financial decisions for them.
Yes.
What qualities do you think are most important when selecting these types of relationships for yourself?
Yeah. So experts really emphasized to me, and it made sense. It's kind of an aha moment once they said it to me, that the classic mistake that solo agers make in choosing someone as their healthcare proxy or power of attorney is to choose a peer, someone who is their own age. Very often, people who are partnered will choose a spouse, or if they have adult children, they'll choose an adult child. The most common choice for a solo ager is a sibling. And a sibling is likely to be, within a few years of you and face the same challenges of aging as you do. So the ideal person is someone who might be a generation younger,
That's really
someone
smart.
who is mature enough to handle the responsibility and understanding of what you might be facing, but younger, so is not facing the same challenges. Might be a niece or a nephew or a much younger cousin or the child of a cousin, thinking along those lines. And then you really need to find someone who is willing to do it, who's willing to take on the responsibility. I mean, very often, if we can get ourselves to make the choice, we don't do the second beat of that, which is talk to the person and make sure they're on board, because you don't always know. And then you want to revisit every couple of years, because circumstances
That's a
change.
great
Their
point.
circumstances do, your circumstances do. The person who made sense 2 years ago may not be the person who makes sense today. So those are some of the things you want to think about.
That's a great point. And I know it's probably a little touchy, but the vetting process, because somebody as a friend or whatnot, but to turn over such personal decisions to them, like medical or financial, any thoughts on that? I realize it's very particular for each individual situation, but
I think that's a great question. And I think that, one of the things that we as personal finance experts tell people all the time when they're doing a will, or you want to write down what you want to happen, what your wish list is for your care, but also personal things like, how you want your pet taken care of, or, just, the whole gamut of things. And so I think when you're vetting someone, you want to have those thoughts in mind, and you want to have that discussion like, this is what I want. Would you feel comfortable doing this? You know, if you want them to run a second opinion by someone, here's who I'd want you to talk to. Would you do that for me? Like you really have to kind of get, I don't know if down and dirty is the
sure.
right expression, but kind of, right? Like you have to be willing to go there. And the payoff for going there is that you will feel so much more comfortable. And then you can set it and forget it for a little bit of time, and
Sure.
you have that peace of mind.
That's those are excellent points. And my wife and I just revisited our will, and as we were doing that, realized how incredibly outdated it was.
Yeah,
When we did it when our son was quite young. But so there are a lot of concerns and that we've been talking about that solo agers have, and financial security is of course a big one. They don't have the immediate family members to rely on for the financial support should emergencies come along for long-term care. Without that traditional family support, how can solo agers create a financial safety net? I know that's a major part of what you do write about and have kind of studied over the years, if you will. But really to cover those financial needs in the future or for emergencies, and how is that maybe different from what people who aren't solo agers, what they might do?
yeah. Well, I think that it's certainly true that it's critical, and solo agers do have particular challenges when it comes to money. They tend to have less in income because it's one income versus two, and they tend to have less in savings. So they have fewer assets to work with. And that means, again, like you have to be extra special careful. It's back to that intentionality and the urgency. So there are a couple of things that I would suggest. First of all, not having money for emergencies is the thing that causes the most anxiety in everyone.
Sure.
Solo ager, young person, like just across the board, research shows that the thing that gives us the most financial anxiety is the feeling that we're one emergency away from financial disaster. So having a plan for emergencies, it goes beyond, the traditional advice of an emergency fund. It's really thinking through, like, what are the what ifs? What could happen? Having a plan and a sense of control, like who you could turn to. If you had to move, like, where would you go? Could you downsize? Like, going through the what ifs is as important as having an emergency fund, because you want to have a sense of control. An emergency fund, just having some money set aside for emergencies, is critical. The way to do that, if you're still working, open an account that's dedicated to that, that says my emergency fund, because money that you have labeled for a specific purpose is money that you're likely to not touch. And then automate from your paycheck. You can do it through your bank, through your employer, just whether it's $50 a week, $25 a week, a certain amount of money that goes into that account. And then the other thing you want to do is, you don't want to use it, but you want to have it available to you, lines of credit. If you own your own home, a home equity line of credit that you don't tap, but it's your emergency fund if you had to tap it. And a credit card that you then put in the freezer in a block of ice, and that you never use, but that it's there for you if you need it. And just knowing what you would do, where you could turn, brings peace of mind. Oh, I'm sorry. One other thing that I just want to say is that sitting down for a one-time session with a financial advisor to go through all of that is another way of creating a safety net. And there are a lot of pro bono resources if you can't afford it. Often your local area on aging, your local agency on aging can suggest pro bono planners who will do it. Local senior center, AARP, so you can get free help.
Great. Good thoughts, good suggestions. And, it is just the whole notion of sitting down and thinking through it, so that if something does happen, when your mind is racing and you can't focus, at least
Yes.
knowing where to start, and having something, even if it was a year or two before that you jotted it down, just having that to start with, I think, would be comforting for a lot of people.
Yes.
So, when we're talking about solo aging, we've been talking a lot about, some of the negative or stressful aspects. In writing the article, were you able to uncover any benefits or positive things about being a solo ager?
I am so glad you asked that question. Absolutely. In fact, there was an AARP study, I think it was last year, about solo aging. And they asked respondents for, their feelings about being a solo ager. And the first three responses were all positive. It was, prizing independence and feeling satisfied and happy with their lives. And the number one positive aspect was freedom. So, there are benefits to not having to run what you want to do by somebody. Like, you want to travel, you can travel. Whatever your idea of an ideal retirement, or just, what you want to do as you grow older, you don't have to compromise. You don't have to get anybody's permission. So there's a great freedom in that. And I think that that's a huge benefit of, for solo agers.
Great point. Good. So now I'm curious, what are you looking forward to as you age?
I am looking forward to sort of, I hate to be a cliche. I feel like I'm looking forward to the things you always hear people look forward to. But the most precious commodity to me is time. So I am looking forward to, I still work full time and full throttle full time. So I'm looking forward to slowing down a little bit. I'm looking forward to time to be more present for the people who I care about, to be able to be more in the moment, to take walks, and to, like, just all of that stuff, just to take life at a little bit of a slower pace, to be more present for the people who I care about, including myself, and to travel. I really do want to travel, and I haven't done a lot of that. So I feel a little bit like a cliche, but
And hey,
but
there's a
truly,
reason. There's a reason for that, right?
yeah.
And
And
I
also, I
mean,
have a couple of passion projects
what are
that
they?
so I have uh, an idea for a movie that I've had since I left graduate school. So
Interesting.
here's an idea I've been nursing for more than 30 years, for more than 40 years. And I would love to be able to do a magazine article and see if I could get it done, if I could get someone to look at a treatment. It's based on a true story. I'm surprised that nobody has picked it up. I think it has Clooney, Pitt, Ben Affleck, like that sort of thing all over it. So
Very
here's
cool.
one.
That's great. I can't wait to see how that comes about. So shifting gears, you had done a keynote at a recent AARP event, and you spoke earlier this year in New York about financial longevity and retirement. And in this speech, you paused for some reassurance and a promise. And you said that no matter where someone is in their financial journey, you can come up with strategies to make your money last your lifetime. So, for those who may have begun saving later than ideal, what advice do you have to help them maximize their savings now?
Uh, First of all, I really and truly believe that like, wherever you are, there are steps that you can take. And I think it's critical for people to understand that because the number one regret people have when it comes to their money in retirement is not starting to save sooner and not starting to save enough. And it's important for people to realize, first of all, that everyone shares that, me too, even though I do this for an actual living. You know, I often say, and I said it, I think in this speech, that believe me because I've done this for 40 years and I'm an actual expert, but also because I've personally made every mistake there is to make when it comes to your money, and I'm living proof you can bounce back. So that's true when it comes to getting a late start on savings. If you're still working, what you want to do right now is pump it up, you know, to use that old SNL sketch.
Sure.
So, you know, whatever you can do right now, the first thing is if you're working for a company that offers an employer sponsored plan and it has a match and you are not contributing up to the match, like there is no excuse. You've got to do that right away. And one of the benefits of getting older is that you often have to wait when you're younger to vest, and people move companies a lot, and you might be afraid of layoffs. When you reach full retirement age, you are automatically vested in those contributions. So even if you've been at that company for a month,
Interesting.
you get the full match. So there's nothing you have to worry about. It's 100% return on your money. So do that. If you're already doing that and you have the wherewithal to save more, really just pump it up to what you can. People 50 and older can contribute more than younger people. There are catch-up contributions. Starting next year, there's going to be a special supersizing catch-up contribution for people between the ages of 60 and 63. So you can do even more. I mean, it gets up to crazy amounts of money, like over 30,000 for that 60 to 63. And, you know, my feeling is if you have enough to contribute that much, you probably are not that worried about retirement savings. But the idea is to do as much as you can. And when you do it automatically, you often automatically adjust your budget so you don't feel it. So that's the first thing. I would
That's
also say you have to look for ways to reduce your expenses to create the possibility of saving more. And the number one thing that I would say in this regard, there are lots of smaller things that you can do, and I have done them and we can talk about them. But if you are someone who still has an active, open branch of the Bank of Mom and Dad for adult children, you got to think about shutting that sucker down. I mean, again, this is something that I've done, even, you know, against my own advice. They're your children. You want to do right by them. You want to give them a good launch in life. But but research shows that it really, really hurts people's ability to save for retirement, to retire when they want to. So that's the number one thing, is to start thinking about shutting down the bank of mom and dad.
That's a great point. And
Uh,
it is just probably you're right. Something that nobody wants to do. They want to feel as if they're being good parents, but at some point, you're probably being a better parent by focusing on your own financial security, so that your child doesn't have to worry about you later in life.
Yeah, absolutely, and also helping them towards true independence. I mean, if you want to reassure yourself that you're actually doing the right thing as a parent, there it is. I mean, it's part of our responsibility to help them truly launch and be able to do things on their own.
That's great. That's really smart. Thank you. So we know healthcare is a huge expense in retirement. How can retirees plan for healthcare costs and to avoid depleting their savings?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge thing in retirement. Fidelity estimates that people will need the average person will need $165,000 just to cover healthcare costs over the course of their
Wow.
retirement. So it's a big number. So that's $315,000 if you're as a couple. The first thing that I would say is, if you are younger than 65 and you are thinking of retiring early, you might think again, because those years before, covering your healthcare costs before you qualify for Medicare, if you're not working, is really, really expensive. Nearly half of people who take Social Security early do so in order to pay for healthcare costs. So if you can do whatever you can do to bridge that, maybe you have access to retiree coverage through a former employer. Many people don't, or COBRA, workplace coverage. But you really want to try, if you can, to bridge yourself to 65. And when you are eligible for Medicare, people often opt for whatever the lowest premium option is when it comes to health insurance. And actually, you might be better off to pay a little bit more in premiums and get more coverage for your out-of-pocket costs. Of that $165,000, nearly half goes to deductibles, coinsurance, and copays. So if you can get health insurance, traditional Medicare plus a Medigap, a really comprehensive Medigap policy like Plan G, or an Advantage plan, but one that where the premiums are a little higher, but you're paying less out of pocket for things like copays, it's often worth the trade-off. So think about that when you're thinking about health insurance coverage.
Yeah, that's that is interesting. Just thinking about the deductibles and everything that goes along with it, that I think people don't often think about. But also, to your point, we might think that we can kick the can down the road, if you will, for some of those costs by getting the lowest cost right now. But you really should be looking at value, right? Not just simply the lowest cost.
Well, the lowest cost, what will be the lowest cost in the long run,
Yep.
is really what I'm talking about. We often think about, well, what are we paying for this policy? And that's what we're going for, is the lowest cost. But if you're going to have a lot in, and it's unpredictable, right? Like, I'm generally a very, very healthy person. And year after year, I have very little in the way of healthcare costs until this year. And I had a health emergency. If I had not had, if I had gone for the lowest version, I am of Medicare age, and I have a Medicare policy and a Medigap policy, Plan G. And after my $240 deductible, I didn't pay anything for the out-of-pocket cost. It was, very expensive. Hospital stay, lots of doctors afterwards. I'm totally fine now.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
But you never know when that's going to happen. And I would have been, it would not have been the cheapest policy if I had just been going by what my monthly premiums were.
That's a great point. That's a great point. You'd be in probably a very different financial situation now if you
Yes,
hadn't made that
yes.
decision.
I'm very grateful.
So you're a financial journalist, obviously, as we've talked about. You've been reporting on retirement savings for many years. What are some of the biggest changes in saving strategies and attitudes that you have come across or that you've observed over the years?
Yeah. Well, I think there are two huge shifts that have really changed the landscape for everyone. The first thing is the shift in the responsibility for retirement savings to individuals from the employer. I mean, for many, many years, pensions were a thing. And outside of the public sector now, they're really rare. And so truly the onus is on individuals to come up with a strategy for what their income will be in retirement. And that requires a totally different mindset. And along with that, because people were not stepping up and contributing to their 401ks in the way and similar plans in the way that they need to replace pensions, there have been a lot of changes in the way those plans are being managed, like automation of savings and defaulting people into plans. And that's an ongoing thing, because what we found is that most plans now default people into the plan, so they don't sign up; they have to opt out, and that's increased participation rates, but they're saving at too low a rate because they're defaulted into something that's not going to be able to sustain them in retirement. So there's a lot of shifts going on with that in putting the responsibility for funding your retirement on the individual. So that's one big shift. And then the second big shift that we're right in the middle of now is just rethinking the very notion of retirement. It used to be you worked, and then you stopped and you retired. So it was very black and white. It was, there was a working period, and then you retired, and then there was an end date. And now retirement is much more of a spectrum, a continuum, as and a change that I think is quite wonderful and has a lot of potential for people. But it's a different way of thinking about retirement, that retirement doesn't necessarily mean not working at all. So those are the two big shifts that I see.
Absolutely. And it was interesting. Yesterday, I was down in Baltimore doing some group discussions with older adults, and everybody in the group said that they were not planning on retiring, that the word retirement was a negative to them because of exactly what you're saying. And, this was in a community setting, and they were really encouraging and suggesting that the community set up co-working stations and perhaps even have a part-time administrative assistant that could work there and really support that. And another couple was looking at having two apartments adjacent to each other that they could actually take, rent, if you will, and using one as a studio and a workspace and the other as their living space. So it's just interesting how this group it was a very urban, group, but really thinking about what was going to meet their lifestyle, not where can we retire.
I love that. I love the idea of these communities having co-working stations and the idea of an administrative assistant. I think that's so cool. I love that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And speaking of working longer, you're pardon me, you were cautious about full-time work as a catch-all for financial stability. Instead, you suggested that retirees keep a hand in the workforce, not your whole body. I love that phrase. Talk about that strategy.
Sure. So I have to tell you that it is a pet peeve of mine when people suggest, experts or government officials, and that's people of both parties. Like, this is a nonpartisan issue. People constantly suggest that just working longer is the solution to people not having enough money for retirement, or people like to call it a retirement crisis. I do not. I don't think we're in crisis. There are things we need to do, but people figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And telling them that they're in crisis does not help. So the reason that I can't stand it, even though it's absolutely true that working longer can really help your financial situation, even just a couple of years, extending it by a couple of years can give you much more money in retirement, both because it delays, your collecting of Social Security, it delays you having to tap savings. So theoretically, it's a good idea, but come on, let's live in the real world. And in the real world, hello, ageism. People often want to work but can't work. Also, hello, healthcare issues. We get older, and the reason that a lot of people retire earlier than they expect to are either because they were laid off or they have health issues. So it's not always within our control to simply work longer. And then again, not everyone, especially people who have been, like really working like crazy, want to work until they're 70. Maybe you want to slow down some. So you take the theoretical positives, um, and maybe you're not working full time, but you work part time. Even if you work half the time you used to, or a quarter of the time, at something that may be easier to do health wise, may be easier to do in terms of ageism because you're consulting, you're not on staff, you're not taking a staff position, you're not earning the same big salary that may make you unattractive to employers. But it has many of the same benefits. It can help you delay taking Social Security. It can help you delay tapping into your savings, or at least tapping as much of your savings. And it keeps you, from a social standpoint, engaged and, again, like in the world. So it helps with some of the loneliness and finding my purpose and meaning in retirement. So I think it's an elegant solution.
All the quality of life sorts of things that we're all striving for.
Yes, exactly.
Now, I'm curious, you mentioned ageism a couple times, and over your career, you've been studying this population as it relates to financial and I'm sure other, several other topics, but talk a little about ageism. Is it with the aging population? We've all seen the studies with the boomers, now well over 65 in a lot of instances. Is ageism becoming a bigger issue? Are we somehow, coping with it or tackling it, or is it just something that will always be?
Well, the realist in me might say it will always be. The optimist in me, and that is 2/3 of me, so more than half, hopes that that's not the case. I think that we are redefining, as we've talked about, in as we redefine what retirement means. I think that will help um, employers and other people see that older workers are still really, really important in terms of expertise and what they bring to the table. I don't think ageism is going away. I think it is. I think it permeates the workplace. I think it is not talked about. I think it's hidden through, employers saying they're just getting rid of, in terms of layoffs, their highest salaried, employees. I think it's still there. I think that there are all sorts of studies, and I wish people would pay attention to them, of the higher productivity of an intergenerational workforce. So if I'm a big believer in appealing not to someone's innate humanity, but rather to the bottom line,
Sure.
because that's what businesses are about. And so, the research actually shows if you have workers of different ages, that is a more productive team that contributes more to the bottom line. And it makes sense because you have older workers who are able to teach and mentor and who bring deep expertise to the enterprise, and you have younger workers who may bring a certain pace and energy and being more on the cutting edge of technology. I don't want to do the slam against older people that we're not technologically savvy, but come on, we're not as a
Sure.
group technologically
Not digital
savvy as
natives.
right. So there's so much the two can learn to and enhance with each other. So I wish that there was more attention to the bottom line benefits of having that workforce, but I don't think that that's the case. And I think that from a practical standpoint, thinking about how you can, if you want to continue working, how you can continue to do that. And it might not be as a staff member if you're laid off, other ways to contribute and keep your career vibrant. Um, uh, it behooves older people to think about that from a practical standpoint.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Well, now I'd like to shift and talk a little bit about something that I pay close attention to, and I certainly know a lot of people out there do as well. And that's the slow but steady disappearance of printed magazines. And I still love I love getting the New York Times. We subscribe and get it on Sundays, and there's something tactile about having the printed
Yeah.
piece, the printed periodical coming in. And as we said at the beginning of our discussion, you were the deputy editor of Newsweek from 2020 to 23. Now, Newsweek had printed its last issue and shifted to digital only in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, and then returned to print again in 2014. You're a part of the team tasked with reinventing Newsweek for the digital age. What were some of the biggest challenges you faced when reinventing Newsweek as a digital-focused publication?
Yeah, and I will add to that a big part of my responsibility at Newsweek was running the print magazine.
Okay.
So it was a particular challenge there. So I think that in terms of reinventing for the digital age, you have to think about um, uh, how do you maintain quality journalism when there is just a voracious appetite for content on the web, right? So one of the challenges, if what you need to do is just churn out lots and lots and lots of stories to attract your audience, which was the first wave strategy of big media companies turning to the web, was just thinking we have to get all this traffic and we have to do it by publishing many, many, many more stories a day. But when you do that, quality often suffers.
Sure.
And so the tension between publishing many more stories a day and figuring out how to maintain quality, or at least maintain quality in a portion of the enterprise, I think was one of the great challenges, and that media brands are still looking for. And then the second big challenge of a digital first publication, I almost hate that phrase these days, I have to say, because it's all digital.
Right.
Like, it's not digital first anymore. It's just digital. And there may be a print component, and I'm a big believer in having a print component for brands where it makes sense. Newsweek is one of them. But I think that the business model changed completely. And so media brands were used to relying primarily on either advertising income or subscriptions to fund the enterprise. And that's no longer viable. Like, it's no longer viable to rely on either one or the other, or even just those two. You have to have, a diversified way of generating revenue. And if you're good at it, you have to have a diversified way of generating revenue that doesn't interfere with journalistic integrity. And that has been
That's a great point.
the great challenge for not just Newsweek, but every large legacy media brand and digital upstarts.
Sure. Lots of sponsorship opportunities, but you want to make sure that the integrity of the journalism is still there.
Yes. Well, so an example is there are lots of media properties that that have some sort of relationship with retailers and high quality ones. Like let's take the highest quality one, the New York Times, in my opinion, has a brand within the larger brand called Wirecutter, which is a consumer product research and recommendation site, and they do a terrific job. I think it's really, really high quality. I love Wirecutter. But part of the strategy is to get and there's and it's fully disclosed that you get a commission basically, for any time somebody purchases through that. So there's nothing wrong with the quality of the recommendations. They're not recommending things just because they have a relationship with them. But what they are doing, and CNN does it, and Newsweek does it, and Forbes, everybody is doing it these days, is that there's a barrage of emails and newsletters and exhortations to buy. And that is not in readers' or consumers' best interests. And so that's problematic, let alone the lesser quality sites that may be recommending things because they have a relationship with the retailer. I don't want to, like both things go on. The highest quality ones don't do that. I mean, they don't. But it's problematic. It's very tangled,
Sure.
and I think that's still in the process of being sorted out.
It is interesting because obviously, whether we use the term digital first or what have you, when you've got commerce happening online and the information being presented online, it does really blur the channel. So it
Yeah.
becomes one and the same.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it's something that we just really, as an industry, media, has to sort out. Because, maybe I'm a little too Pollyanna-ish about this, but I really believe that at its core, you have to have journalistic integrity, and that will bring readers. That will bring, what you want to happen to the bottom line. But you have to do it with integrity and care for your readers.
That's great. Now, do you see a day when the printed media disappears entirely?
Again, I don't think I'm being Pollyanna here, but I don't. I definitely think that that just as we've already seen, although I think a lot of the damage has already been done. Maybe damage isn't the word that other people would use, but sort of to me, I mean, we definitely will see less in print. But just as you said, and kind of just the same that has happened with books,
Mm-hmm.
People like the tactile sensation of being able to hold and see. You read in a different way. So I think that print will stay around, but it's often for a different purpose. Like you, I'm a New York Times subscriber, and Monday through Saturday, I'm all digital.
Yep.
And Sunday, I'm all about print. And what's different there? It's because I'm reading for a different purpose. Monday through Friday, I'm reading for information.
Mm-hmm.
I want the news. I want what's going on. On the weekend, I'm reading more for pleasure and my personal interest. And when you do that, I think you want a different experience. And I think that happens with magazines. It happens with books. You see, I read all the time on my Kindle, but when I go to the beach or when I'm relaxing in my backyard and reading a book on the patio, I like to hold a physical book in my hand. It's just a different, more pleasurable experience. And I think that'll happen. That's the fate of media. And I also think that it will stay around because it's one of the reasons that Newsweek not only brought back print, but during my tenure actually added issues to the number that we put out. And you have to, media companies have to think about what is the value added of having something in print. And besides sort of the experience that we've just talked about, it is the kinds of sources and experts you can attract.
Yep.
People, it still means something to people to be on the cover of Newsweek. Can't tell you the number of people, well, but can I be on the cover? We wouldn't have had a cover story. We were the only magazine to have Prince Charles write for us. And he wouldn't have done that if we hadn't been able to, well, for a lot of reasons, but
Sure.
but if we hadn't put him on the cover. Same with Dolly Parton. People that means something, or world leaders. So I think that there is an authority conferred by print that will not go out of style, and value that a print product can bring. And I hope it stays around.
Well, it is interesting to think about how life has changed. I mean, if you think about even in music, everybody had sounded the death knell for physical media, and there's been a resurgence in vinyl over the last 10, 15 years, something like that,
Yes.
and it's really remarkable.
Yeah, and I love that blend. It's I love that blend, and I just think that we have to define what is the value of whatever the platform or the medium is, and understand that they're different. When we were looking to print and digital journalism to do exactly the same thing, maybe that was not the right way to think about it. Like, what can print do for you and for your readers that you can't do digitally, or that would be enhanced by having a print product? And I think that is the same thing when it comes to books and with music too, that they should not be doing the same thing. There's overlap, there's huge overlap, but long form journalism often it's a better read in print, or it's enhanced by having a print component. So I think people have to think about that.
Sure. Now these shifts, what's the impact on journalism? We've talked about that a little bit, and you shared some thoughts. Has the transition to digital changed the way stories are researched, written, or edited?
Yeah, I they definitely have, and I think that more of the changes in my mind, having been around for a while, are not good ones, but there are some things that are good as well. So I'm going to start with the good ones because you rarely hear that. And as a journalist, and especially one now who I've gone back and forth between editing and managing and writing my entire career, and I'm in a phase where I'm doing probably 50-50. But in the writing portion of things, the amount of research and data and access to sources that the digital world has unveiled is phenomenal. What would have taken me so long early in my career to identify sources, to get their research, to read it, to figure all of that out, is instantaneous. It's just phenomenal in a really, really good way. And you can find better sources, people who are better suited. You can find the data. You can look at the trends. It enhances the stories by multiple factors. So I think that that's great. I think that we talked about this voracious appetite for content and the need to post many, many, many stories, has made the reporting thinner, has fewer sources, fewer uh, whole stories written just by background research or by talking to somebody via email. Not the same thing as deeply reporting and interviewing someone and talking to them. Not the ability to spend time with the writing on the craft of what we do. It's not just great reporting that makes a great story, it's great writing. And so there's just not time for that. And by the same token, there's not time for the same amount of editing. So there are more mistakes. There's more misinformation.
So as a
And
journalist, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no. I'm just like so that is sad for
Yeah.
me.
I was just going to ask, and sorry to interrupt, but how with all of the resources online and AI and everything else, how are you sure that the background, obviously if you're talking to somebody, that's firsthand, but how can you be sure that the content that you're reviewing is legitimate or something that you can trust as a reporter?
Yeah, well, going to trustworthy sources. So, like, if you're looking for research on a particular topic and studies, and you know the academic institution and uh, where the researcher has come from, you really have to pay attention to the quality of your sources and the institutions that are providing the data. So, and to think about, because sometimes we are talking to sources who have a bias, um, and we're talking to them because of that bias. Like, it's not always like because they have a particular perspective, but as a reporter, you really have to be aware of that and understand what might cause them to say or to have the perspective that they have, and take that into account. You really have to do more vetting of your experts and your source materials than you did a decade ago.
Great point. Great point. Thank you for that. So we've talked about some heavy things today, and I want to have a little fun before we wrap up our discussion. I'm going to name some iconic magazines, and you tell me if you think it's still in print.
Oh, this is a scary quiz for journalists. Watch me fall flat on my face
Well,
here.
we're not out
That's okay.
to expose anything, but just
That's
curious to
okay.
see.
Yeah.
So 17
Oh my
magazine.
goodness. 17. 17, digital only.
You're right. It's not in print. It shifted in 2019 to be digital only. How about Life magazine?
Oh, kaput. No.
Yep, it was not.
Yeah.
It's not in print. It shifted in
Yeah.
2000 and again in 2007. Made a comeback in 2004 as a printed weekend supplement,
Right.
but stopped printing again in 2007. Good, two for
Yes.
two. Rolling Stone.
Print.
Yep, yes, still in print. Reader's Digest.
Print.
You got it. Popular Science.
Oh my goodness. Popular science. Okay. That's Hearst, right? Um, Popular science. I'm going to say print.
Not in
No.
print. It shifted in 2021,
Okay.
but close. Okay, and then last one, one that actually my parents started subscribing to before I was born, and we have them all in our house. National Geographic.
Oh wow, National Geographic. I should know this. Um, Nat Geo. I'm going to say not in print.
It is still in print.
Oh,
However,
good.
they
Yeah.
stopped printing for newsstands just this last year, and they're only doing print for subscribers. So it's kind of
Oh, that's interesting because that's what I was thinking about. Like it's funny when you mention that. What I default to is a mental picture of a
yeah,
newsstand.
absolutely. So you're right in that regard. I saw the headline earlier
So I
this
get
year
half a
that
point.
yep, half a point. I saw a headline earlier this year that they were stopping printing, and my heart stopped for a moment, and then realized it was only
Yeah.
for the newsstands. So
Well, and that's I mean, there's an example, and actually it's true for life too. I mean, the beautiful photographs
mhm.
seen in print. Like I mean, certainly digitally they could especially in an immersive template can be beautiful. Are
Mhm.
beautiful also, but in a different way. I
Absolutely.
like to see photographs that are printed.
I agree. I agree fully. And I do think that National Geographic is one of the more, if not the most popular Instagram account, certainly within the media world, for that
Oh, that's interesting.
exact
Yeah.
reason, because of the imagery. But so, one final question. What
Yes,
have you
sir.
learned that you wish you could have told your younger self?
Yeah. You know, um, Kind of like what I'm looking forward to as I'm aging. Uh, some of that answer is the stuff that everybody says. I do wish that as someone who came to fitness and exercise late in my life, what they tell you about like exercising and eating right and everything, like that's true. You should really do that stuff. And it makes such a difference. And that's, you know, uh, doing it now, starting to save early, being more present and in the moment and nurturing the relationships in your life, because that's what will sustain you in the long run. All of that stuff that people say is true, and things that, listen when people say that stuff, I would say to younger Diane.
That's great.
But I wanted to think about something that you might not always hear. At least this is what I would say to myself, and that is be bolder.
Hmm.
I wish in my life that, I'm a person who, um, none of us really like change, but I'm really one of those incremental change
Sure.
kind of people. But being bolder has always rewarded me when I've been pushed into it. And so maybe, if I had taken a year to live abroad and see a different perspective, or I've lived in the greater New York metropolitan area my entire life, if I'd moved to a different area of the country and seen a different perspective, um, I just, or if when I was making a very good living as a journalist at Time Inc., in a big, like if I hadn't been quite so bound by golden handcuffs
Mm-hmm.
and had done something that spoke more to my passion and took time to do that. So just being
I
bolder
love that.
in your choices, um, rewards you in the end and leads to a richer life. It's not always about richer in the traditional sense
Right.
of things. So that's what I would say to younger Diane.
That's great. Well, Diane Harris, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. I've always enjoyed our conversations, but thank you for spending, such a good amount of time with us today. And thanks to everybody for listening again. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks with another episode of Roundtable Talk. Also like to thank Dave Schaffner, our producer, and Matt Campbell, our engineer. Have a
Thank you. It
great
was
day.
my pleasure. It was a great conversation.
Bye, Diane.
Bye-bye.